My family is a homeschooling family, and the fact that this is such an unusual and eccentric thing isn't lost on us. We knew that if we decided to pursue this kind of education for our kids, it would raise eyebrows and provoke criticisms, so we spent a lot of time deliberating over this question and the advantages and the disadvantages of it. What's kind of amusing about that fact is that when we do encounter those criticisms, the people that are offering them seem to be under the impression that we've never heard them or considered them before, when in fact the concerns that are often raised are pretty obvious. So I thought it would be fun and maybe even cathartic to address some of those concerns and to describe some of the reasons that inspired us to take this leap into uncharted territory. Let me say that even though I'm defending the reasons why we decided to homeschool, I'm not saying that all kids should be homeschooled or that homeschooling is universally better than public schooling. They both have advantages and disadvantages. In the case of our family, we thought the advantages outweighed the disadvantages. So let's start with what is probably the most common criticism that people raise. Aren't you afraid that they won't be properly socialized? The longer we embrace this journey of homeschooling and witness the effects that it has on our kids, the more I feel like this question is pretty ironic. Both my wife and I went to public schools as kids, so we're both pretty familiar with the socialization that it offers. And while this might sound harsh, it's what I would describe as a Lord of the Flies model of socialization. Public schools benefit from a lot of social interaction, but that interaction is largely left up to the kids to figure out on their own. Aside from making sure that violent outbursts were prevented or at least punished, teachers and administrators weren't involved in social aspects of student society. From the moment the academic lessons were over, we were sent outside for recess or lunch to figure out how to get along ourselves. And I'm convinced if those recesses were longer than 15 minutes, they would have descended into tribal warfare. Socialization is something that needs to be deliberately taught through lessons about virtue, patience, understanding, compassion, and goodwill. In my experience, we didn't get that. And it's no wonder why the things I experienced as a teenager are things I desperately want my children to be spared from. Some people might accuse us of sheltering our kids. And they'd be right. By the time I was 13, I had been given the opportunity, and in many cases under the burden of peer pressure, to take drugs, commit petty crimes, have unnecessary sexual encounters, and be abusive towards my peers. Our intention as parents is to shelter our kids until they're at an age in which they can be confident in who they are without needing the affirmation of cohorts who won't necessarily have their best interests at heart. I've read numbers as high as 64% of kids saying that they were bullied at some point in their adolescence. That can be a traumatic experience that will have permanent effects on how they interact socially because it happened to them at an age where their brains were still developing. The likelihood of our kids encountering something like that at a point in their lives when they are most vulnerable to its effects is dramatically reduced because of the fact that we're homeschooling them. The next concern we hear sometimes, and it's one we had ourselves, is whether or not they'll fall behind academically. I would say that this is a legitimate concern depending on what kind of curriculum you pursue with your kids. In our case, we do traditional homeschooling, which means that we don't follow all of the elements of the public school curriculum. So if at some point our kids want to participate in that system, they might struggle in some areas. But this actually raises a concern for me about the way our public school system works. One of my hangups with my own education is that I was never really taught how to learn or given much emphasis on how to think for myself. I was given information that I was expected to accept as true, and then I was tested on it to make sure that I had assimilated that knowledge well enough to be able to recite it. Every point of development to me seemed like it was geared towards the next phase of academic training. When I graduated from high school, I felt like I hadn't been taught any useful skills for employment. I hadn't been shown anything about how to manage my finances or file my taxes, or even that I had to file taxes. I hadn't been taught anything about how to be a husband or a father or a responsible citizen of society. I felt like the only thing I had been taught was how to get the grades I needed to get into college. Teaching our kids to succeed according to the precepts of that system is not one of our fundamental goals as homeschoolers. We want to teach our kids the fundamentals of reading, writing, math, science, and history, of course. But more than that, we want to instill in them a love for learning on their own. We want education to be part of their everyday life instead of something that is sequestered into an institutional framework between the hours of 9 and 3. We want to give our kids room to discover their passions and their talents, and then to give them the opportunity to follow them. In short, we want our kids to be successful because they have something unique to offer to the world. After all, success is defined by being able to do something that only a few people can do. If the public system is designed to create uniformity in knowledge and skill, then doing something different seemed like a great way to give our kids the opportunity to stand out in unique ways. The last thing I want to touch on is that my wife and I have very strong values. We are principled people who try to live according to our principles, rather than shaping our principles based on the way we happen to live. These are values that have been the cornerstone of the successes that we've been able to enjoy in life. And so we've been very intentional about teaching those values to our kids. Unfortunately, when the public school system is funded by taxpayer dollars, politics and ideology have a way of creeping into the curriculum and student life. Take, for example, that the province that I live in has recently elected its first socialist government in a long time, and based on the approval ratings that I've seen, is experiencing some buyer's remorse. In spite of this fact, this same government has been frantically writing a new curriculum without letting anybody know what's in it until it's released. They also tried to shut down the Homeschooling Association that my family is connected to, only to have a court injunction prevent the shutdown and force the government into a position where they had to reinstate funding and accreditation. It's been fairly obvious to anyone who's been paying attention to their designs on our education system that they want to form a generation in their way of thinking. And when the teachers union is a big supporter of this particular political party, it's not hard to assume that they'll be given way more reach than they deserve. We don't want the education and formation of our kids to be bound to the designs of ideologues. We want them to be able to think for themselves without carrying the burden of not conforming to the expectations of an institution or the governing party who happens to be writing the checks. Thank you so much for watching. We're going to try and make one of these videos a few times a month, and hopefully we can get it up to about once a week. And they're going to be about topics that are interesting to me and hopefully interesting to you too. And so if they are, please subscribe and come find me on Twitter and elsewhere, and stay tuned.